The budget deficit will not be wiped out until 2031, the Treasury watcog has suggested, a staggering 16 years later than George Osborne originally pledged. The Office for Budget Responsibility OBR rejected Philip Hammond's claim that he was still on course to balance the books by about 2025 as increasingly unlikely. Instead, it suggested the most likely year was now 2031, warning it could be even later, as Britain's ageing population piles more pressure on the NHS. The cause was an economy weaker than the OBR forecast just 9 months ago, with growth and productivity growth shrinking and borrowing set to rise as a result. The verdict is a big blow to the Chancellor, who had rebuffed pre-budget pressure to publicly accept that the 2025 date to eliminate the deficit was doomed. In his speech, Mr. Hammond did not mention the target, set out in the Conservative election manifesto, but, speaking later, his aides insisted it remained in place. But, said OBR Chairman Robert Choate, the books would not reach balance until 2031, if the deficit fell at the trend rate of reduction. And, over this period, there is also likely to be upward pressure on spending from the aging of the population and other cost pressures on the health service, he warned. Furthermore, the forecast ignores Brexit, because with no clarity on Britain's exit terms, it is impossible to calculate the impact of EU withdrawal. When the coalition came to power in 2010, after the financial crash had created a record deficit of 11% of GDP, it pledged to eliminate it in just 5 years. But Mr. Osborne failed spectacularly, extending the target to nearly a decade, before Mr. Hammond, following the Brexit referendum, put it back to the mid-2020s. The OBR's latest forecast came after the auditor slashed its GDP growth forecast for this year from 2% to 1.5%. Growth will also be slower in the years to follow. It won't, at 1.4% in 2018, 1.3% in the following 2 years, and 1.5% in 2021, before expanding by 1.6% in 2022. The OBR also delivered the biggest downgrade to productivity growth in its history, with output per hour expected to be 4.6% lower in 2022 than thought in March. This was the sort of growth experienced pre-industrial revolution, the OBR said. Only a period at the end of the 19th century had been as poor. As a result, borrowing, although £8.4 billion lower this year than expected, would be a total of £90 billion higher over the next 5 years as a whole. GDP would also take a 0.2% hit by 202,122 because of lower immigration than previously forecast, especially of younger workers, following the Brexit vote. Meanwhile, earnings were set to grow at just 0.6% a year in real terms, through to 2022, with disposable income, after tax and benefit changes even more sluggish, at 0.3%. The Resolution Foundation think tank said GDP was now set to be £500 lower per person by 2022 than was expected even as recently as March. For context, that's just over 14 of the drop in GDP per person recorded between 2008–2010, tweeted Matt Whitaker, its chief economist. Mr. Hammond was still on target to hit his fiscal rule that borrowing will be below 2% of GDP by 2021, but by a smaller margin. And he was helped by the surprise decision to take tens of billions of pounds of housing association debt off the state balance sheet, which the OBR questioned. Reuse content.